Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really fundamental concept in biology, hypoxia. In simple terms, it's when a living organism doesn't get enough oxygen.
Right. And that can be widespread, the whole body, or it could be just localized in one area.
And the key thing is it means a reduction in aerobic metabolism. That's the really efficient way our cells make energy, but it needs oxygen.
Exactly. Think about the air we breathe. It has an oxygen pressure of about 160 millimeters of mercury, mmHg.
Okay.
But inside our mitochondria, the cell's powerhouses, that pressure drops way down. If it goes below about 1 mmHg, well, aerobic metabolism just can't happen properly.
It's important to say a little dip isn't always like a crisis, is it?
No, definitely not. Strenuous exercise is a perfect example. Your muscles might experience temporary physiological hypoxia. That's normal.
Right.
What we're focusing on is when this oxygen reduction becomes problematic. And just to be clear, anoxia technically means no oxygen at all, though people sometimes mix the terms up.
Good distinction. And what's really fascinating is that this state, this relative tissue hypoxia, seems to pop up in a lot of different diseases.
It does. It's a common thread.
And many of those diseases are ones where hyperbaric oxygenation, HBO, is used as a treatment. So that's our mission today. To really unpack the complexities of hypoxia using the material we've gathered, we want to understand its effects, especially on the brain.
Which is very sensitive.
Exactly. And then look at how HBO might fit into the picture. Okay, let's get into it.
Absolutely. So to understand hypoxia's effects, we need to look at what oxygen normally does in the cell.
Right.
The vast majority, maybe 80%, goes straight to the mitochondria for energy production, that efficient oxygen-dependent process.
Okay, the main energy factory.
Precisely. The other 20% is used by other cellular components for various metabolic jobs, building things, breaking things down, detoxification.
All sorts of housekeeping.
Yeah. But here's a really interesting point. Some enzymes that make neurotransmitters the brain's chemical messengers that actually have low affinity for oxygen. They don't grab onto it very strongly.
So what does that mean in praxis?
It means that even a, let's say, moderate drop in oxygen can lead to what's called transmitter failure. Nerve cell communication gets disrupted before there's necessarily a massive energy crisis in the cell.
Wow, okay. So it's not just the power going out, it's like the communication lines failing first.
But sorta, yeah. That's a good analogy.
Our sources talk about 3 main stages where the oxygen supply can get messed up. Can you break those down?
Sure. Think of it like oxygen's journey. Stage 1, getting oxygen into the lungs, the respiratory phase.
Breathing it.
Right. Stage 2, transporting it around the body via the blood, the transport phase. Hemoglobin's job, basically.
Okay.
And stage 3, the tissues actually being able to use the oxygen that arrives the tissue utilization phase.
So a problem anywhere along that chain
Can lead to hypoxia, exactly.
And the material also mentions something that sounds a bit odd, that hypoxia can make oxidative stress worse. How did that work?
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? More oxygen usually means more potential for oxidative stress.
Right.
But when cells are starved of oxygen, a couple of things happen. The electron transport chain in the mitochondria gets backed up, which can actually lead to more leakage of reactive oxygen species, those damaging free radicals.
No. Yeah.
And at the same time, the lack of oxygen means the cell doesn't have the energy it needs to repair damage or maintain its normal balance. So you get increased damage and reduced defense and repair. A nasty combination.
That makes sense. Now, a key player in how cells respond to low oxygen seems to be this Hypoxia Inducible Factor, or HIF. What is that?
HIF is essentially the cell's master switch for dealing with low oxygen. It's a protein, a transcription factor, that senses when oxygen is scarce.
And it does what then?
It activates a whole suite of genes to help the cell adapt and survive. Things like making more red blood cells, encouraging new blood vessel growth, shifting metabolism to pathways that don't need as much oxygen.
Kind of like an emergency response coordinator.
Exactly. And HIF-1 alpha is the main one in most mammalian cells. It involved in physiological adaptation, cell survival, managing pH, even adapting to exercise.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting with HBO. The sources suggest the interaction between HBO and HIF isn't straightforward. It's not just more oxygen turns HIF.
That's right. It seems to be much more nuanced and context-dependent. It depends on whether HIF-1 alpha is already upregulated or downregulated in this specific disease state.
Can you give an example?
Sure. In one study on acute pancreatitis in rats, HBO seemed beneficial, possibly because it downregulated HIF-1 alpha, which might have been contributing to the problem in that case.
Okay, so it reduced it there.
But then in another study looking at fibroblast proliferation, those cells needed for wound healing. HBO's ability to stimulate their growth disappeared when HIF-1 alpha was suppressed, suggesting HIF was actually needed for that positive effect of HBO.
So opposite effects depending on the situation.
Exactly. And even more complex, in diabetic animals with poor wound healing, adding more stabilized HIF-1 alpha along with HBO actually improved healing even further than HBO alone.
Wow.
So it suggests HBO might sometimes stabilize and activate HIF-1, boosting certain repair processes. It's not just flooding the system, it seems to modulate the existing response.
It's fascinating. It really paints HBO as more of a targeted tool than just a blunt instrument.
Precisely.
Now, another group of proteins mentioned are the heat shock proteins, HSPs. What's their connection to hypoxia?
Right. HSPs, they're the cell's general stress responders, originally found in response to heat, hence the name.
Makes sense.
But they're also produced under other stressful conditions, including hypoxia. Think of them as cellular chaperones or bodyguards.
Protecting other proteins.
Yeah, helping them fold correctly, preventing damage, cleaning up messes. HSP70 is a major one.
Okay.
And interestingly, one study showed that even just transient mild hypoxia breathing slightly less oxygenated air at normal pressure could trigger HSP70 release in healthy people.
And does HBO influence these HSPs too?
It seems so. There's research suggesting HBO can prevent certain types of cell death, like apoptosis and cartilage injury, partly by boosting HSP70 expression.
So protecting the joint cartilage.
Potentially, yes. The idea is that increased HSP70 helps protect the cartilage cells, suppress inflammation, and promote repair. It's another potential mechanism for HBO's effects.
Okay, let's shift focus back to the direct impact of hypoxia on how cells make energy. It really throws a spanner in the works, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It directly hits mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation, the main ATP generator. Production plummets.
And we see signs of cell damage.
Yes. Things like creatine phosphorylase leaking out of cells, which normally stays inside. That indicates membrane damage. Calcium levels are also implicated. Blocking calcium influx seems somewhat protective.
Why calcium?
Well, the rapid drop in ATP makes it harder for the cell to pump calcium out. So calcium can flood in, which activates damaging enzymes. Plus, ATP breakdown products like hypoxanthine can fuel the production of superoxide, another damaging free radical. It's a cascade effect.
It really is.
Our material introduced Barcroft's classification of hypoxia. Can you quickly remind us what the different types are?
Sure. It's a way to categorize hypoxia based on the cause. First, hypoxic hypoxia. Not enough oxygen getting into the lungs. Think high altitude.
Okay.
Second, anemic hypoxia. The blood can't carry enough oxygen. Not enough hemoglobin, or maybe carbon monoxide poisoning.
Right.
Third, stagnant or circulatory hypoxia. Blood flow is too slow, like a traffic jam delivering oxygen, even if the blood itself is okay.
Exactly. And fourth, histotoxic hypoxia. The tissues receive oxygen but can't use it, like with cyanide poisoning.
That's a helpful framework, and the table provided lists a huge range of specific causes falling into these categories.
It does. For inadequate lung oxygenation, you've got high-altitude hypoventilation, lung diseases, sleep apnea. For transport issues, there's anemia, CO poisoning, hemoglobin abnormalities, circulatory failure, poor microcirculation.
A long list.
Then there's relative hypoxia demand outstripping supply, like in severe inflammation or extreme exercise. And finally, tissue utilization problems, like poisoning.
So given all these causes, what's the general impact on the body? It must be pretty widespread.
Oh, absolutely. The effects vary hugely depending on the cause, the duration, acute versus chronic, and the person's health. But cellular hypoxia is a key factor in things like multiple organ failure.
Because the tissues are starved.
Either starved or unable to use the oxygen that's there, or their demand suddenly skyrockets. And restoring oxygen supply isn't always enough. Sometimes metabolic support is needed too.
Let's look at specific systems. How does breathing respond? You mentioned it can speed up, then slow down.
Yeah, it's a bit counterintuitive. Initially, low oxygen triggers faster, deeper breathing. The body tries to compensate.
Makes sense.
But if hypoxia persists or is severe, the respiratory center in the brain can become depressed, leading to slower, shallower breathing. Also, if the hypoxia is caused by poor breathing, you get CO2 buildup, hypercapnia.
And that's dangerous.
Very. High CR2 causes breathlessness, then confusion, stupor, and eventually it can be fatal.
Okay. What about the heart and blood vessels, the cardiovascular system? Mostly animal studies here, right?
Mostly, yes. The response is complex. Locally, in the hypoxic tissue itself, blood vessels usually dilate to try and increase flow.
Except in the lungs.
Right, the lungs are the exception. Vessels constrict there to shunt blood away from poorly ventilated areas. But elsewhere, especially active tissues like heart and brain, you get vasodilation.
Trying to get more oxygen in.
Exactly. Simultaneously, oxygen sensors trigger reflexes that increase heart contractility and selectively constrict muscles in less vital areas to maintain blood pressure and prioritize flow to the brain and heart. The net effect is usually increased cardiac output with this targeted redirection of blood flow.
And metabolically, what other general changes are seen in these animal studies?
Well, you often see excess lactate as we discuss the shift to anaerobic metabolism. At high altitudes, there's an increase in 2-3-DPG in red blood cells.
Which helps oxygen release.
Precisely. Stress hormones like corticosterone go up, driving glucose production. And adapted animals might show changes in blood fats.
Okay, let's really zoom in on the brain now. Our sources stress how incredibly vulnerable it is. Why is that?
Several reasons. One, massive energy needs, even at rest, met almost entirely by burning glucose with oxygen. Anaerobic backup is tiny.
So it's constantly demanding fuel.
Constantly. Two, virtually no oxygen storage. It can only tolerate maybe 3 minutes of complete oxygen loss before damage starts.
That's a tiny window.
Frighteningly small. Three, unlike muscle, it can't really grow new capillaries easily to compensate. And four, neurons are notoriously bad at repairing themselves after hypoxic injury.
That really highlights the tight link between brain function, energy, and blood flow.
Absolutely critical. The brain uses about 20% of your total oxygen intake and gets 15% of your cardiac output, despite its small size.
And it does this without doing physical work.
Right. It's all for maintaining ion gradients, making neurotransmitters, all the electrical and chemical signaling. Its energy metabolism is a constant balancing act between ATP use and resynthesis.
You mentioned the glucose oxidation quotient and respiratory quotient.
Yeah, basically measures showing how tightly linked oxygen consumption and glucose use are in the brain. It normally uses about 6 oxygen molecules for every glucose molecule, and glucose is usually its only fuel.
Though some might go to lactate.
A tiny fraction, maybe 5–10%, possibly as a sort of emergency exercise buffer.
The material breaks down cerebral metabolism into glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and the GABA pathway. Can we walk through those simply?
Sure. Glycolysis is step 1. Breaking glucose down anaerobically in the cytoplasm. Doesn't need oxygen, produces a little ATP.
Okay.
Normally its product, pyruvate, enters the mitochondria. There it's prepped and enters the citric acid cycle, or Krebs cycle. That cycle generates more energy carriers, which then go to the electron transport chain. That's where the big ATP payoff happens, and where oxygen is essential as the final electron acceptor.
Huge difference in energy yield.
Massive. Like 38 ATP from full oxidation versus just 2 ATP from glycolysis alone. Glycolysis is regulated mainly by the enzyme phosphofructokinase, responding to the cell's energy charge, the balance of ATP, ADP, and AMP.
And the GABA shunt, what's its role?
It's a metabolic side loop, handling about 10% of the glucose carbon. It's linked to making and breaking down the neurotransmitter GABA, and also helps detoxify ammonia and regenerate other amino acid neurotransmitters. Pyruvate can also enter the citric acid cycle directly via pyruvate dehydrogenase, another key enzyme sensitive to energy levels.
So that's the normal picture. What happens to all this when hypoxia hits the brain?
Well, the lack of oxygen slams the brakes on that big ATP production in the mitochondria. The whole system shifts towards a more reduced state, chemically speaking, and the tissue becomes acidic.
Because oxidative energy fails.
Right. So the cell desperately tries to compensate by ramping up glycolysis, that anaerobic pathway. It does this because the ATP-AMP ratio drops, signaling an energy crisis.
But that produces byproducts.
Yes, pyruvate and NADH accumulate. An enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase then converts these to lactate and NAD+. Regenerating NAD+ is crucial to allow glycolysis to continue, even inefficiently.
So lactate buildup isn't just waste, it's part of a coping mechanism.
Exactly. It buys the cell some time, helps maintain some structural integrity, even though it contributes to acidosis. In total anoxia, glycolysis can increase 4 to 7-fold, with big shifts in metabolic intermediates.
Are some brain areas hit harder than others?
Yes. Studies using labeled glucose show the hippocampus vital for memory white matter, and certain relay centers seem most sensitive.
Why white matter?
That's an interesting question. It might relate to why we sometimes see white matter damage after anoxic events. Maybe it's less densely packed with capillaries, making it more vulnerable if swelling occurs. It's a hypothesis.
And important to note, hypoxia and anoxia aren't quite the same in their effects.
Correct. In hypoxia, oxidative metabolism is impaired but not completely gone, unlike anoxia. The damage unfolds differently, often described in stages.
Beyond energy, what about those neurotransmitters you mentioned earlier? How are they affected?
Significantly. Acetylcholine synthesis is impaired because it needs oxygen. That directly links to memory and learning deficits. Some think cholinergic drugs might help in certain hypoxic states.
Okay.
Catecholamines, norepinephrine, dopamine, their production from tyrosine is also oxygen-dependent, so their levels drop. Serotonin turnover is reduced too, as is the synthesis of some amino acid neurotransmitters derived from glucose.
So communication is definitely disrupted. What about the brain's ability to control its own blood flow autoregulation?
That gets severely impaired or even blocked by hypoxia. Normally, brain vessels adjust to keep flow constant despite blood pressure changes. But under hypoxia, that breaks down. Often, you get widespread vasodilation, making blood flow much more dependent on systemic pressure. You can get patchy areas of very low flow next to areas of excessive flow, the luxury perfusion syndrome.
Does blood flow just stay high then?
Initially, it might double post-hypoxia, but that's often blunted if hyperventilation lowers CO2. Over days, as the body adapts, making more red blood cells thanks to erythropoietin, blood flow tends to normalize. Longer term, like after weeks, capillary density can actually increase. Different control mechanisms at play.
And what happens within those tiny blood vessels, the microcirculation?
Problems there too. Platelets tend to aggregate, clump together in the hypoxic brain. Then red blood cells can follow, causing sludging.
Like a traffic jam at the micro level.
Exactly. Slow flow makes it worse, and it can lead to stasis, blockages, and worsening of brain damage.
And the blood-brain barrier, the BBB.
It's energy dependent, so hypoxia compromises it. Active transport mechanisms fail, particularly getting glucose into neurons becomes difficult. This can cause secondary problems with fuel supply.
Leading to swelling.
Yes, cerebral edema. BBB damage allows fluid to leak out. And since autoregulation is lost, increased pressure in capillaries pushes more fluid out. This edema raises intracranial pressure, squashes blood vessels, reduces blood flow. It's a vicious cycle worsening the hypoxic injury.
How does this show up electrically, like on an EEG?
Very quickly. EEG activity starts to diminish within 10-30 seconds. Responses to stimuli, evoke potentials, get depressed within minutes.
And this reflects energy levels.
Directly. EEG changes correlate well with the brain's energy state, like the creatine-phosphate ratio. The frequency and amplitude tell you how severe the hypoxia is. Electrocerebral silence, a flat EEG, happens at very low venous oxygen levels or after just 6 seconds of total anoxia.
So physically devastating. What about mentally? Our ability to think?
Profoundly affected. Classic studies, like McFarland's work at high altitudes or with CO poisoning, showed impaired senses and judgment very clearly.
And this applies to various conditions.
Oh, yes. Chronic CO poisoning, high altitude living without oxygen, severe sleep apnea, COPD all can cause significant mental impairment due to chronic or intermittent hypoxia.
Could it even play a role in age-related decline?
It's been suggested as a potential contributing factor. Even moderate hypoxia affects higher cognitive functions first. Things like dark adaptation can be impaired at fairly mild levels. Psychological tests show deficits as it gets worse, and then gross mental deterioration follows.
Although you mentioned a paradoxical effect with mild rapid hypoxia.
Yes, some studies found slight improvement on simple tasks with very mild acute hypoxia. It highlights that the effects depend heavily on the specifics: how fast, how severe, how long.
Does hypoxia leave lasting structural scars on the brain?
Sometimes surprisingly few visible changes immediately after, say, a cardiac arrest if the person recovers, but patients in a vegetative state often show cerebral atrophy, brain shrinkage with reduced blood flow and metabolism on scans.
What might you see on CT or PET scans later on?
Weeks later, you might see lucencies or less dense areas in the white matter on CT. PT scans often show reduced regional blood flow and oxygen metabolism, and these findings tend to correlate with the neuropsychiatric problems the patient has.
There are tests to assess the damage.
Yes, brain imaging is key. Also, biomarkers in the blood, like serum S100B protein, can indicate CNS injury and help predict outcomes after events like cardiac arrest.
Okay, let's bring HBO back into this. Given all these devastating effects, how can it help?
Well, the most direct way is simply boosting oxygen delivery. For hypoxia caused by lung issues, regular oxygen often suffices, but HBO shines where transport or utilization is the problem.
Like CO poisoning.
Exactly. CO poisoning, non-healing wounds, maybe stroke, global ischemia, situations where getting more oxygen dissolved in the plasma, bypassing hemoglobin limits, can make a difference.
And neurons can survive for a while without oxygen.
There's evidence they can tolerate maybe 20 to 60 minutes of complete anoxia without irreversible damage and potentially recover function. HBO could support that recovery process, especially if blood flow is compromised.
It's also used in cancer.
Yes, tumors often have hypoxic cores, which makes them resistant to radiation. HBO can help oxygenate those areas, making radiation therapy more effective.
And you mentioned a link to nitric oxide earlier.
Right. Hypoxia makes immune cells stickier to blood vessel walls. HBO seems to reduce this adhesion,
How?
partly by inducing endothelial nitric oxide synthase, ENOS. This enzyme helps relax blood vessels and has anti-inflammatory effects. Blocking ENO, it reduces HBO's ability to decrease inflammatory markers like ICAM1, suggesting this pathway is important for HBO's benefits in hypoxic injury.
But like any treatment, HBO isn't without potential risks, especially in these fragile situations.
Correct. One theoretical concern is oxygen toxicity, the paradox of using oxygen to treat oxygen lack, but potentially causing free radical damage.
But could it actually reduce free radicals?
That's the counter-argument. Partial oxygen deprivation might actually cause more free radical leakage from mitochondria than either normal oxygen levels or the high levels under HBO. Correcting the hypoxia might shut down that abnormal leakage. It's complex.
Any other dangers?
Concerns have been raised about the carotid bodies, those oxygen sensors in our arteries. Some animal studies show prolonged hypoxia, or even HBO, might slightly blunt their responsiveness, possibly via oxidative stress or other mechanisms.
Why does that matter?
They help regulate breathing in response to low oxygen. But interestingly, they also seem involved in insulin sensitivity. Some research suggests HBO might improve glucose tolerance in type 2 diabetes,
How?
potentially by functionally blocking the carotid bodies, similar to how high oxygen levels normally do, which could favorably impact glucose metabolism. It's an active area of research.
This has been, well, a truly deep dive. Hypoxia is clearly incredibly complex.
It really is. Far more than just not enough air. It's a cascade affecting energy, signaling, inflammation, everything down to the cellular level.
We've seen how it disrupts energy production, triggers responses via HIF and HSPs, sometimes helpful, sometimes not, and how profoundly it impacts the brain, neurotransmitters, blood flow, electrical activity, our actual thoughts.
And while HBO offers real potential in certain contexts, modulating some of these processes.
It also comes with caveats and potential risks that need careful handling.
Absolutely.
It leaves us with a final thought, perhaps. Given how sensitive the brain is, and how many ways hypoxia can occur, acute, chronic, mild, severe in our modern lives, what are the longer-term implications we should be thinking about for cognitive health, for overall well-being, especially with subtle, maybe unrecognized oxygen deprivation?
That's a critical question, isn't it? What are the downstream effects of these potentially chronic, low-level hypoxic stresses? Something definitely worth considering further.